Yes, thank you very much for joining me again. This is a bit of a series of talks that we are doing together in sort of generally on the theme of an introduction to the principles of Theosophy. So we're working through the various subjects, and today's subject, as Richard said, is the human constitution. This actually is a presentation that I gave originally at the beginning of December, and so some of you may have been present for that, but it felt as if it was still fit for purpose, and I've mixed in a few different angles here, which relate to the body and some of our scientific thoughts around these subjects, and a bit of psychology as well. So, as is always the case, I really want to encourage a bit of a discussion at the end. So I'll work through the deck, and then we will try and create a bit of a chance for discussion. So Gary will record me presenting the slides, and then we'll stop the recording at the end so that we can talk freely if we wish. So we'll have a look at the sort of theosophical view of the sevenfold nature of the human, or man, as we're always referred to in the theosophical texts, and look also at spirit and matter as being really poles of one reality, and with humanity as a very conscious link in this enormous tapestry of creation. Of course, the materialists will have it that we are just a collection of atoms and kind of randomly assembled through some accidental process. But there have, throughout all of man's history, been various belief systems which have come to the conclusion that we were more than that. And whether it's Plato's threefold division that we see here of body, psyche, and nous, or St. Paul in Thessalonians talking about body, soul, and spirit, or indeed our own theosophical sevenfold constitution, there is a universality to this idea that the human being is more than just dense material. The picture here of roots is really designed to show how deep these beliefs go in all of human civilization. It seems to be some inner tuition that we have, some intuition or inner tuition that we have, regardless of what we may have studied. So why do we talk about seven parts to the human? And we'll go into it in a bit more detail in a moment. Well, those of us familiar with Theosophy know, of course, that seven is a very key number in this particular universe. And whether it be, seven planes of nature, or seven states of consciousness, or seven rays, we see it occurring all the time in our own studies. In the human constitution, we see seven individual parts, which are divided into an upper three and a lower four. We might call the upper three the spiritual and the lower the physical. So we hear this term, the quaternary, the four, and the triad, the three, sitting together. Of course, it's always worth reminding ourselves, and I do try always to remind myself, that wherever we try to separate anything in order to learn, we are still talking about a unity. The separateness is a bit of an illusion. So let's just dive into these seven principles of man. And here I've created the table with the most spiritual and permanent at the top, and the most physical and temporary at the bottom. And that kind of implies a hierarchy, which I suppose is in some way intended, but it's not meant to convey the idea that the physical body is in some way a worthless thing. Of course, it's a beautiful creation, and it's an almost perfect vessel that has been evolved so that all of these other aspects can experience life and learn and fulfill their purpose. But nonetheless, for the purposes of being able to explain this, we have to put it in some kind of order. So here we have some Sanskrit words on the left and a bit of an explanation about what they are in English on the right. A different way of looking at them, you'll see different expressions and different phrases used throughout different texts. But broadly, there's pretty much agreement on what each one of these represents. So we have these top three, Atma, Buddhi, and Manas, 7, 6, and 5, as that spiritual triad. And then the bottom four, Kama, not to be confused with Karma, Prana, Linga Sharira, and Sthula Sharira, as the lower quaternary. So if we stick with English and we think of the physical body, the astral body or etheric double, the vital force, that which brings life, and then desire, nature, emotions, feelings, and passions, all gathered together in this lower quaternary, and then mind, spirit, or if you like, intuition, the vehicle of spirit, the soul, if you want, and the absolute spirit, the will of the absolute creator in this upper triad. So we'll go into a bit more detail about this as we move on. So in the upper triad, as I've said, we have this ray of the absolute, this very permanent, immortal fixture, and the vehicle of spirit or soul, if you prefer, an intuition known as buddhi. And then we see here manas beginning to be divided into two. So although we have 7, we have a subsection in manas or mind of the higher and the lower mind. So in the higher mind, the higher manas, we have this part of our individuality, which is the reincarnating part with the buddhi and the atma. In the lower quaternary, we have this lower manas. And we'll talk a bit in a moment about how they work together and how they're joined. We also have these desires and passions. We could argue that desires and passions are, in some way unique to the physical world, but I'm not sure that that's the case. The vital energy, prana, often equated to electricity, and this kind of template, this blueprint, if you like, etheric double of our actual physical body, which is this actual flesh in which we are occupying. So I talked about the higher manas and the lower manas, and this sort of dual nature, the higher spirit, atma, buddhi, manas, the lower kama, passions. And there's this very important bridge, and I've got a picture of a bridge here, between these two, which sometimes known as the Antakarana, which is a very critical part of our own development as we try to create integrity and coherence between our lower and upper self. So we will talk about evolution in another talk, and when we do talk about evolution, we'll also be talking about involution. There's the monad, if you like, this spark of universal life, which has come from the absolute and evolved throughout the mineral, plant, and animal, and into the human stage, where it has been able to find self-consciousness. Of course, consciousness exists in a theosophical view in all stages of evolution. But where we get this quite unique level of self-consciousness at the human stage, it implies that the human being is very critical in the evolutionary progress and occupies a pivotal position in creation. When we talk about evolution in more detail in a later talk, we'll introduce the idea of involution, which is the initial part of coming down from the very spiritual into the densest physical, and then evolution going back up again. But I've used the term evolution here because it's easier just to explain it in those terms. And is the goal of this process to unfold divinity and to create consciousness on all planes? I want to spend a few minutes talking about genetics and epigenetics because they seem, on one level, entirely scientific, but I like to think that as we begin to understand this subject more, we will increasingly be able to see analogies between what we're learning about genetics and epigenetics and, in fact, what we see in the ancient wisdom. So we have this idea of a kind of blueprint in genetics, which has parallels, at least, to this idea of a blueprint of our body, an etheric blueprint. One of the interesting things about genetics and epigenetics is that although if you take, for example, identical twins, they when they're born, their genetics will be identical, their genes will be identical. But if they live different lives, perhaps separate lives under very different circumstances, at the age of, say, 50, their genes will have changed. And that's what's known as epigenetics, that our genetic blueprint is not fixed in stone. It's very much dependent upon how we live and what we experience, which has a kind of spiritual angle to it. And I think that the more science begins to learn about this, the more we will start to see parallels with some of the ancient wisdom. I also wanted to introduce this theory, the polyvagal theory. And if you think about your body and picture the base of your brain, if you could look in there, you would see this nerve, the vagus nerve, coming down from the base of your brain into your spine and then out into various parts of your body, your lungs, but including especially your gut, and this theory, which is very respected scientific theory now, shows just how integrated the brain and the body are via this particular nerve system, and especially the gut, which is a very important part of our physical system. So this is the system that switches on the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system and introduces things like threat and freeze and fight and flop when we're in danger. And the entire nervous state of us, of our physical being and our mental well-being and our emotional well-being is very closely linked to the state of our polyvagal system and the vagus nerve. The word vagus comes from the Latin for traveler, which is the same root as words like vagrant. And it shows the enormous extent of this nervous system and how it travels all through the body. What we know is that things like breathing, chanting, and listening to sounds at particular frequencies can immediately calm the vagus nerve and the polyvagal system, which really does begin to bring science and spiritual knowledge together again, because the ancients have known this for thousands of years and have been practicing such things as meditation and breath work, yoga, and so on. And now the science is beginning to catch up and understand why this is the case. This is all as much a part of our human constitution as any of the other parts. Another thing I wanted to just cover is this idea of the default mode network. This is what's known as the sort of ego network in our brain. And this is ego with a small e, where we're sort of very focused on ourselves. And it has been proven that meditation reduces the volume of this, what's known as the DMN. And the ego begins to recede and go quiet. Ego in the sort of modern sense, not so much in the theosophical sense. And this shows how we are able to influence our mind, our thoughts, our emotions, and indeed become more altruistic and more community focused through meditation. There is very respected science showing how DMN is proven to be reduced by meditation, and people who've meditated for thousands of hours and then had their brains measured in MRI scanners, and this has been well documented. There's also enormous neuroplasticity in the brain, which is increasingly being understood, which is to say that it was thought until really quite recently that the brain was a physical thing, and therefore if it was damaged, it would stay damaged. And parts of it were there to do certain things, and when they were broken, the brain could no longer do those things. But it's now demonstrated that the brain can adapt. And for example, my own mother had a stroke and became paralyzed on her left-hand side. But through some rehabilitation and some training, she was able to fully regain, at the age of then 92, fully regain the use of her left-hand side. The brain was still destroyed in that particular area through the bleed that occurred. But what happened is the neuro pathways have been reformed elsewhere and repurposed. So this indicates that there is a non-physical part of the brain which is in charge, because the physical part of the brain was dead and it remained dead. But it's almost like being able to dig a path around some kind of obstruction. And there's some kind of will, if you like, that's driving this, which is not really understood by science. But the evidence is overwhelming that neuroplasticity is a thing. It's also worth touching on the subject of near-death experiences, because we're talking about the fact, and our theory is, as Theosophists, that we are not merely material beings. And I will cover death and after death in a later talk, but it's worth just reflecting on the fact that science has been flummoxed by the fact that near-death experiences are so common. There have been experiments where things have been placed in the OR hospital room, which could only be seen outside of the body, and in fact were seen and were identified by the person when they came back to life. And there are many other studies as well, which I'll go into in that other talk on death and after death. So, if as materialists, we start as human materialists, we start to have to accept that there are experiences outside of the body after death, then it really challenges where the body begins and ends. So it doesn't necessarily give answers about what happens after death in a more ongoing sense, but it does challenge this idea that the body is just material, just a group of atoms, because if that were the case, how could it have any experiences when it was switched off? Another subject which is interesting for us is the pineal gland and the idea of the third eye, and whether or not these two are in fact one and the same thing. There's no scientific body of evidence to support this, but of course there's an enormous amount of spiritual evidence. But one of the interesting things about the pineal gland is it has been shown to contain something called magnetite, which is present in the birds, for example, and helps them to navigate. It connects to the magnetic poles, and so this idea of us having some kind of gland in the center of our brains, which is not divided in two, which has some purpose, which is not understood by science, but which is in some way linked to magnetism, does rather leave some open questions, knowing what we know from a spiritual perspective. The subject of breath is really important, and we know that, or at least most of us know, that breath really regulates our anxiety, and that it represents a very, very practical bridge between body and spirit. All of the ancients have been practicing breath work, chanting, and contemplative prayer for thousands of years in all traditions. And of course, at one level, it's very physical. And here we're talking about the human constitution and the physical body and the physicality of breath coming in, resting, and going out. So there's a very cyclic nature to this, which is very resonant of the cyclic nature of the universe. This in and rest and out, repeating endlessly, which is resonant of even the idea of the universe itself being created and then resting. Every single tradition has breath at the core. They have different names for it. I've put a few of them here. But there's some deeply intuitive understanding in humans all over the world about the importance and the spiritual and physical importance of breath and how core it is to any kind of practice that we might try to take on. We can make the comparison, as I said, with the great breath, this eternal motion of the absolute, as HBB said. The idea of this out-breathing of a Manvantara and the in-breathing of a Pralaya. And this notion of as above, so below in the Hermetic axiom reminds us that the human breath could be just a microcosm of that great cosmic breath. So every time we breathe, we are being reminded of the creation of the cosmos. There are, of course, ethical implications for the way that we are constructing this constitution. So in the kama manas, the lower mind and the desire body, we could sense the presence of things like selfishness and greed, which of course are there for a reason. They have been created for a reason. To help us to develop and fulfill our potential, we need some resistance. We need something like a tree that needs wind in order to grow strong. And in the buddhi manas, this higher mind, we see the compassion and unity and the understanding of oneness. And our goal seems to be this shifting from the lower personality into that which is higher and more permanent, and to live as kind of conscious bridges between the two, not to treat one, the lower, as if it were in some way soiled or dirty, but to be fully embraced and fully integrated as whole human beings. I made a bit of a light-hearted analogy here with AI computing, because I thought it was interesting how man has created this new sort of computing phenomenon, and how easy it is to sort of just do a very simple parallel between the various parts of the AI computing world and this sevenfold constitution of the human. This isn't really meant to withstand much scrutiny, but I just thought it was interesting, thinking of our body like the hardware of a computer, and the prana as the electricity in the computer, and then this kind of operating system, and so on and so on. So as we begin to bring this slideshow to a close, I want to just encourage us to reflect on the fact that we, humans, are the link between spirit and matter, and are destined to be conscious on every plane of being, that we are very much bridges, and that our breath, our mind, and our spirit unite us. And what I've tried to do here is to look at the combination of science and psychology and physicality and theosophy to see how actually it all points in a very similar direction. So here are a few questions for you to consider, and perhaps they'll help us as we go into our discussion. So where do you experience the bridge between spirit and matter in daily life? How do you feel that important bridge between these two elements in your day-to-day life? And how do you notice the pull between desire and ego and compassion and wisdom? Where does that manifest itself for you? What might these near-death experiences, and the people who have experienced a near-death experience talk about some profound sense of unity and love? What might that suggest about the real nature of consciousness? And if breath is both physiological and spiritual, what practices do you use to help you as a bridge in order to find calm or to seek insight? And if indeed I'm right, and modern science and ancient wisdom are pointing in the same direction, what does that mean for how we should be living now? So thank you very much for your attention.